So, a plane was carrying three passengers: a Girl Scout, a rabbi, and a Nobel Prize winning scientist. The pilot came running out of the cockpit. He said, "There's engine trouble, and the plane's going down, and there are only three parachutes. I've got a wife and two kids waiting for me at home. I must survive." And with that, the pilot grabbed one of the parachutes and jumped out of the plane. The scientist stood up and shouted, "I'm the smartest man in the world, and it would be too great of a tragedy if I lost my life." And so he also grabbed a parachute and hopped out. Well, the rabbi looked sadly at the Girl Scout and said, "I have no family. I'm old. I'm ready to die. Here, you take the last parachute." But the Girl Scout said, "Hold on, Rabbi. We're all right. Because the smartest man in the world just jumped out of the plane wearing my backpack." You know, it's amazing how just a few choice words can change our entire perspective. From bleak to bright, from hopeless to hopeful, from a posture of limitations to a vision of unlimited possibility. And that is clearly what's happening in the passage we just heard from Isaiah today. Isaiah was a prophet, a preacher, in other words, whose words were recorded during the Babylonian exile, one of the most hopeless times in the history of ancient Israel. It was horrible. Here's the story. That small nation had been invaded and defeated by the powerful Babylonian Empire almost 600 years prior to the birth of Christ. Now, the way it worked in those days, when you defeated a country, you plundered its wealth. I guess it still works that way. You, you also destroyed its religious shrines, and you brought back home with you the political leadership and the merchant class and the upper classes of the people, including all the religious leaders. And you left behind a remnant of the native folks to keep the local economy going. You know, you still needed to make money from those people. And you also left behind enough soldiers to occupy the place and to enforce your rules, collect taxes and such. And if the previous lower level bureaucrats weren't willing to play ball, well, you left behind some of your own people to run things, to collect taxes, and make sure that that area stayed loyal to your king. That is how you built an empire then, and how people still do it these days. It was a devastating experience for everyone, but especially for those who were forced into exile. They were suddenly living in a foreign land among people who were really different from them. For those exiles from Israel, they were without a temple where they believed God dwelled, quite literally, so they felt very far away from God. They were forcibly removed from the land that had been promised to them and that made up so much of their identity. Their Exodus experience out of Egypt to get to that land had really molded them, formed them as a people. But now all of that was just gone. They were living under a dictatorship in a foreign country with no hope in sight to ever return home. And they wondered, how could God even allow such a thing to happen to God's own people? I mean, aren't we God's own people? So into this experience, the prophet Isaiah spoke, and a lot of what Isaiah claimed God said was really hard for them to hear. It turns out there were reasons for their exile. Most of it had to do with how the people had turned away from dealing with one another in ways that were peaceful and truly just. For a long time, they had forgotten that the whole point of being God's chosen people was to be a beacon of light and love, to express to others, their neighbors, that the God of the universe had a loving plan for right human relationships. Instead, they had embraced their understanding of spirituality as some kind of superior and exclusive club, a faith of limits rather than an inclusive and unlimited pathway. They played this game of trying to prove how holy they were while ignoring the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus didn't come up with that. It's in the Old Testament. They had turned their religious rituals into an object of worship, completely missing the point that their religion was not about any objects or how you worshiped. No, their true faith was made real in how they treated one another and how they treated complete strangers. Now, it's true they were invaded and conquered by a big empire. Whose fault was that? In Isaiah's interpretation of God's point of view, it was their own fault. They had brought it on to themselves because they had forgotten to treat each other and forgotten to treat their neighbors as they wished to be treated. It was all pretty clear to them. So Isaiah pointed all of that out in agonizing, embarrassing detail. Their fate of isolation was the natural result of ignoring God's loving intention that we see ourselves and our neighbors through the eyes of unlimited love. The thing is, their fate was not sealed, and it would never be tied to their past mistakes. Isaiah had given them a reality check, but the flip side of that rather harsh message was a word of hope and new things to come, that God was not done with them yet, far from it. Isaiah begins with this wonderful reminder that God has always been up to doing brand new things and surprising things. He points out the Exodus experience, for instance, where their ancestors, the children of Israel, walked across the dry seabed safely, but the pursuing Egyptian army was drowned. We've all seen the movie, all that. So if God could do something like that all those years ago, what's stopping God from doing something equally and even more amazing? A new Exodus. Isaiah knows what he's doing here. He's taking the most powerful chapter of the ancient mythological saga of their origin because he knows it represents the high water mark, so to speak, in their collective memory. He knows a powerful story like that, rather than being an inspiration to have hope, can paradoxically run the risk of becoming a limitation because it had become that kind of a limitation for the people of Israel. It becomes a limitation because people just naturally tend to say, well, gee whiz, those were the days. If only things were like that again, then everything would be just fine. Which sounds like a nice reminiscence, but it's actually a self-imposed limitation, and we still do it all the time. Because what you're really saying is this: we know those days are long gone and things are never going to be that great again. Again, we're all prone to thinking that way. A nostalgic yearning for the good old days when life was simpler and stuff worked out the way it was supposed to. When things were great. Well, anyway, maybe it's a condition of getting older, but I find myself looking back every so often and saying some version of, if only things were now the way they were back then, especially when I have a conversation with millennials. Of course, the truth is not that everything was perfect way back when, and selectively romanticizing my past positive experiences can really limit my vision of what's possible in my present and in my future. And if I believe my best experiences are behind me, well, think about that. Then what? Am I supposed to believe that everything's going to be downhill from here? That all the parachutes have already been taken, so I just ride the plane down? And if we can do that to ourselves as individuals, we can be just as likely to behave that same way as a group. When my dad was a retired minister and I was just starting out in ministry, he once gave me some advice about what to say whenever you're being interviewed by a job for a job by a church to become their minister. He said to always ask people what the high point was in the life of that congregation. What did they consider to be their glory days? And usually, he said, they'll get a wistful look in their eyes and say, oh, when Reverend Lovejoy was here, we had so many people in worship, and we built the education wing, and we always won the citywide softball church league. We just beat the pants off those Baptists every year. Those were the days. Whatever it is, my dad said, there's always some story or some era in time they look upon as their ultimate defining experience. And that's only natural. But my dad said that's an excellent opportunity to then ask this question. Does that mean that the very best years of this church are a thing of the past? Or are the best years a thing of the future? And what do you think God has to say about that? In the Bible, the one thing God says consistently from the very beginning, from the moment of creation, breathing new life into everything and everyone, is this: do not place any limits on me. Do not try to define me by making an idol of me. Do not assume you know the wideness of my mercy. My love is larger and my hope is higher and my promise is greater than you can ever imagine. I am constantly creating and recreating without any limits. We all have this thing in our heads that says, because something happened that way before, it is bound to happen that way again. And even when we're surprised when something wonderful and extraordinary happens, we'll often say, it'll never get any better than that. But that's not faith. That's not hope. That's not accepting limitations. That is accepting limitations we impose on ourselves. And that's simply not how God created us to live and keeps recreating us to live. Every 24 hours, we are given a brand new day of creation. It's a gift, and how we live it is our choice. Are we to be limited by our past or by some high watermark? Our only real limitation is the depth and breadth of God's love and creativity, and that we know for sure has absolutely no limits.